Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the NLACS Fine Arts Awards presentation. May I request you to switch off your cell phones, please? Okay. We're here today to honor the 4 young artists who have won the awards for the year 2016. You will get a chance to see their work later in the evening when they're introduced to you by Mortimer Chatterjee, who will also show you slides of their works. Chatterjee is one member of the eminent jury, which includes Shilpa Gupta, Abhay Sardesai, and Jaideep Mehrotra, that chose the awardees this year. I cannot thank these jury members adequately for spending long hours in the meticulous selection process that chose these winners. We're fortunate in having with us our keynote speaker, Ranjit Hoskote, cultural theorist and curator, and perhaps the most sought-after authority on art in the city, and dare I say, in the country today. We look forward to his keynote address. The boundaries of art have been extended far beyond our conventional ideas. One of its latest manifestations, that of the performance artist, will be demonstrated this evening by Pallavi Paul. After the performance, Pallavi will have a conversation with Ranjit. As you probably know, this annual NLACS event is usually addressed by our chairman, Mr. Azad Shivdasani. It is with deep regret that I have to announce that due to unavoidable circumstances, he will not be with us this year. However, I'm delighted to tell you that we do have our chairman emeritus, Mrs. Lakshmi Shivdasani, with us this evening. She will later present the awards to the artists. I must tell you that our chairman, Azad Shivdasani, is mainly responsible for furthering the association of the foundation in the area of the fine arts. This is perhaps a reflection of his own personal interest in art. In recent years, NLACS has substantially increased its engagement in the world of art in India. This support takes many forms. Primarily, we give scholarships for degree courses in reputed international institutions. Today's awards, apart from the grant, include a 1-month residency within the country. More than 140 artists have been assisted over the years in some form or the other. Let me take you back to the beginning. It was in 1982 that Rekha Rodwitia received the first NLACS scholarship to study painting at the Royal College of Art in London. In the years that have followed, many artists have benefited similarly. All these have come home to India to establish themselves and gain varying degrees of repute. I think I should name a few. Rekha, whom I referred to earlier, is one of the strongest feminist voices in the world of Indian art. Sheila Gowda, who incorporates sculpture, installations, and photography in her work, enjoys an international reputation. N.N. Rimzen's symbolic and enigmatic figures in metal, fiberglass, and stone have won him an enviable position in the art hierarchy. Priya Khanna is today perhaps the finest art restorer in the country. The list goes on to include other equally well-known artists like Jagannath Panda, Sahej Rahal, Gigi Skaria, Sonia Khurana, Himali Bhuta, and Indra Pramit Roy. And the MS University in Baroda, arguably the leading art education institution in the country, is largely staffed by NLACS scholars. In recent years, we have found that artists prefer to attend residencies rather than acquire degrees. And so the foundation supports them in some of the finest residency spaces in the world. These include Gasworks and the Delphina Foundation in London, the Darling Foundry in Montreal, the ISCP in New York, Skowhagen in Maine, and the Rijksacademy in Amsterdam. The foundation has also had a long-standing relationship with Citadel Art, which is the Pistoletto Foundation in Italy, where artists have attended residencies. This year, NLACS, together with FICA, is supporting a curator at the Goldsmiths College in London. In India, the artists have attended residencies at Khoj, New Delhi, Bar One and Tajski in Bangalore, What About Art, Kona and Space 118 in Bombay, and Sandarbh in Rajasthan. In addition to all these, NLACS also has a curatorial lab at JNU's School of Art and Aesthetics and supports the peer program at Khoj. It funds exhibitions at the Mumbai Art Room and awards museum fellowships together with the IFA Bangalore. There are numerous other projects underway at present and many others in the pipeline. But now let's get down to this evening's presentation. Ranjit Hoskote needs no introduction to this audience. To my cursory few words in the beginning, I will just add that he is the author of 25 books and that he curated India's first ever pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2011. His other very impressive art credentials are listed in your booklet and you can look them up. I now invite Ranjit to deliver the keynote address.
Thank you so much, Amita. Can you hear me? It's both a special pleasure and a privilege to be delivering this keynote lecture because the INLAC's cycle of awards, residencies, and fellowships is it's a very important feature of our cultural life. And across disciplines, I have to say, both the visual arts and when we look at the social sciences, the humanities, and a whole range of other disciplines, INLAC scholars have left their mark absolutely everywhere on India's public life. So for all of these reasons, I think, for me, certainly it's a very special occasion to think about questions of support for cultural initiatives, support for cultural work, and what it means really to be an artist in troubled times. So I'm going to really address some of these questions in what I have to say today. It says in your booklet probably that the talk is devoted to the problem of expertise. But as I began to unpack that, I realized that it needed a few more contexts to sort of historicize it. So I'm just going to begin directly now by saying that I come to this occasion fresh from several months of working very, very intensively on a 2.5-year project, which some of you may well have seen. It's called The State of Architecture, Practices and Processes in India. It's an exhibition with a set of conferences and lectures are constellated around it, which I've co-curated. And in the course of these 3 or 4 weeks that it's been up, I've been actually quite struck by 2 or 3 things. On the one hand, it's galvanized the profession of architecture, the inner world of architecture, if you will. On the other hand, it's reached out and engaged with the community. We've just realized that about 6,000 people have seen this exhibition in its first 3 weeks. Now, on the one hand, you might think this is a matter of great delight, and it is. But it's also led me to think about certain disquietudes, about how we as people within a discipline or domain respond to one another and what our relationship is with the larger community. And this is something that this exhibition has managed to set off. But while I've walked around the NGMA looking at our exhibition, looking at the people, looking at the exhibition, I've been struck by how such a situation is rarely seen in the world of the visual arts. A kind of debate that brings the community together, a platform where practitioners meet their audiences. How often does this happen, and to what intensity does this happen in the visual arts? These are the kinds of questions that I've been wrestling with during the last few months. It also brings me back to a recurrent anxiety that I have, which is the way in which we conduct ourselves as artists, and I'm speaking here not only as a curator and someone who does theory, but also as a poet. There's something in the nature of our contemporary artistic practices which is built around a fundamental paradox, and that paradox is this. On the one hand, as practitioners, we have a certain degree of privilege, the privilege of our practice, the privilege of the rules by which our practices are defined. But on the other hand, there's also a great precariousness in terms of how we exist in the world, how people respond to the work we do. So you have this sense of entitlement on the ground of art. But there's also a vulnerability which gets dramatized, particularly when there are questions of censorship, of public outcry, of misunderstanding, incomprehension. That's when suddenly the artist, the figure of the artist, gets divided into 2 different things. From within, there's a sense that the artist is heir to a prophetic tradition, if you will. The voice of the artist is somehow the voice of the prophet. But the artist is also the outcast, the marginalized, the defenseless. So this is a very peculiar paradox, which I think in all of our practices, all of us in this room have faced this in one degree or another. So that's my starting point for today. And I think our basic predicament is that there is a certain distance that separates artists as a group from this larger community. And it also has to do with the absence of a common language of discussion, whether that language is an everyday explanatory discourse or a more critical discourse. It appears that I'm sorry to be backing you, Pallavi. It appears that we have so many different ways of looking at art and artworks that effectively there are no shared axioms, there are no shared assumptions. So the criteria and parameters by which art gets looked at in the public sphere has very little to do with the field of art. Those criteria, those parameters seem to emerge from the domain of celebrity or the mediatic sphere. And I think that there is really it's a problem, but it's also a very interesting problem. How does one reclaim that space of conversation? So that's something I want to think about a little bit as we go along. But in order to look more closely at why we've arrived at this particular pass, I want to briefly, in the time I have, look at some of the genealogies or lineages that the contemporary artist draws on. Many of these are things that are naturalized, we take them for granted, but I want to tease them out here to see how contemporary artists actually work from, play out, rehearse, and sometimes are held hostage by prior ancestries. Yeah, so I'm going to touch a little bit on the inheritance, the legacy of the Romantic moment. I'm going to talk a little bit about the avant-garde. I'm going to talk about the Gesamtkunstwerk. And finally, I'm going to talk about what might properly be called contemporary art, post-1989. There's a way in which the Romantic moment or Romanticism still informs how artists figure themselves, how they present themselves, and how they're understood to have some kind of place in a larger formation. The notion of the artist as a secular version of the prophet, the notion of art as a special domain, a space premised in the first place on alienation from the whole. I think that is certainly a legacy of the Romantic that we have, which leads artists to see themselves as somehow defiant of and adversarial to conventional structures of society, affect, and so forth. So the key concept here is that of autonomy. And I find this across a range of artists, different generations, whether it was Tayyab Mehta, with whom I had the privilege of having many, many conversations, or Jahangir Sabawala, Akbar Padamsee, Gieve Patel, Atul Dodia. Many of the artists with whom I've had conversations over the decades, the conversation would turn on notions of autonomy. Sudhir, you have a totally different view of this, so you won't be invoked on this particular list. But the notion of autonomy I've always found to be vexed, to be problematic in a certain way, because the question is what is art autonomous of exactly? And when you look at the etymology of this term, it comes from two Greek words, as many of you know already, autos and nomos. It's the self and its particular preoccupations as the ground of a certain kind of law. How far would artists press this notion of one's own law, one's own source of values? I mean, Shelley, for instance, famously suggested that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of humankind. So is the suggestion that art is a source of values that might be more widely socially shared? But if they are heterodox in a certain way, what relationship does that have with the laws that govern the rest of society? Also, if you take the idea of autonomy to its extreme, you would find that you would have nothing in common with the nomos that guides everybody else. So in terms of classical Greek theory, you would set yourself outside of the polis, outside of the city, in which case, what guarantees do you have when you're dealing with society? So I'm asking you to consider where this argument of artistic autonomy can lead if you take it to its extreme. And in the light of that extreme, look at everything else we normally say. And many of us use this argument for tactical reasons. We talk of artistic autonomy. But the question is, have we considered what that does to us in terms of the social relationships that then prevail, or the political relationships between artists and the rest of society? So that's something that I want to leave in play. Now I want to take this idea of one's own independent law as a source of values to another unfolding of this debate that took place in the latter half of the 19th century. So I want to dwell a little bit on the avant-garde, which, as you know, really takes off in the latter half of the 19th century, from the 1840s onwards, with gathering energy through to what Peter Berger calls the heroic avant-gardes of the early 20th century. In that particular scenario, you find that artists set themselves up very strongly on the basis of a rift between themselves and their explorations and the expectations and understanding of audiences. Now, this again is a phantom scenario that remains with us, I would like to think. In fact, I do think. The notion that what an artist produces, creates, the artist's explorations are somehow always a step or two or several ahead of what an audience might imbibe, what is possible for an audience to cope with in a certain way. And Raymond Williams put this beautifully, and I'm never tired of repeating this particular model. Williams, the Welsh cultural theorist, suggested that artists work from a structure of feeling and audiences work from a structure of expectation. And between these, there's either a lag, or there is an attempt to bridge, or there's antagonism. And we're aware of all three possibilities. Whether it's in terms of artists altering possibilities of form, medium, material, sight, a very paradoxical thing happens in the doings of the avant-garde. On the one hand, there is an attempt to continue with the defiance of and a provocation of the audience, but there's also a strange, even tragic desire to bridge that antagonism and to therefore blur the line that separates art from life. And for me, just as autonomy is a key concept of the Romantic moment, I would like to think of language as something that is profoundly important to this avant-garde moment. Is language something that you use to provoke and to produce, paradoxically enough, incomprehension? And I think Pallavi and I will talk about this as we go along. Or is language something that is used as a communicative instrument? Does a work propose its own reading strategies? Or do you have a canon that tells you how to read, tells you what artistic language is really all about? And therefore, what is the place of legibility in the relationship between the artist and the audience? So I would like to think that the crisis of language and legibility is very strongly pertinent to the moment of the avant-garde. Yeah? So that's my second sort of move that I want to make here. I now want to move sort of sideways to look at the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is closely associated with Wagner and with the opera. The Gesamtkunstwerk, very simply, is, of course, the total artwork. Wagner dreamt of a possible music, an expanded art form that would take in all available art forms. And a lot of people who've considered this question of the Gesamtkunstwerk tend to get caught up with Wagner's own attempts at the creation of this grand, flamboyant opera that took in elements of music, theater, dance, the visual arts, and so on. But if you separate it from that historical moment, this idea of a total artwork, a symphonic artwork, remains crucially important. And for many of us, really, artists, writers, theater makers, it is a kind of ideal of which we fall short, but which remains a certain horizon for what we do. And I'd like to dwell a little bit on the Gesamtkunstwerk here, because even as it might baffle its audience, it's really a wager on a new relationship with new audiences. If the suggestion is that your artwork is actually expanded enough to take in the forms and modes of different kinds of arts, you're also suggesting that it's open to different kinds of audiences and different kinds of communities. So far from being a heroic, monumental, baffling kind of project, it could well be a more inclusive project. And I want to align the Gesamtkunstwerk with the things I've said about the avant-garde, for instance. I think if it shares the crisis of language and legibility, it also opens up a new kind of ground, whether one might open up, and this is what Wagner's essay was actually called. It was subtitled The Artwork of the Future. Is that, in fact, the artwork of the future? A kind of work which is unpredictable in the kind of address it makes, that this has something, it speaks a little bit to what you were saying, Amita, in your introduction. Because today, artists might make use of a wide variety of resources, media, even forms. So in a sense, many artists are, in however fragmentary and episodic a way, working with this notion of the total artwork. And it comes into their work as annotation, as possibility, as dream, as hope. So that's the third sort of bookmark that I want to put out today. And the fourth of these genealogies that I've tried to draw for contemporary art is, in fact, contemporary art. And I put it in inverted commas because, unfortunately, we've come to think of modern and contemporary as easily assimilable ideas. For most people, most of us, I have to say, the contemporary seems to be anything that has to do with youth, has to do with strategies that exceed the painted frame or the sculptural object. But I would also like to historicize contemporary art in another kind of way. I think we're looking here at forms of art with forms of institutional support that really got going after 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the bipolar Cold War scenario, and the emergence of new kinds of audiences and new kinds of mobility, circulation, and strategies of representation. So we're looking here at forms of art that moved well away from material objects, that moved towards immaterialization, towards social engagement. Art as pedagogy, art as performance, art as distributed intermedia occasion, and also art as a set of collecting or archival or collaborative practices. In fact, very much the open field that you were speaking of, Amita, in your opening remarks. And whilst all of these are very interesting aesthetic strategies, while they all clearly reflect certain political urgencies, it is also the case that they are far more circulatory, far more mobile, and far more suited to a certain kind of globalized art world. So this is not a judgment, it's just something I want to put out there to talk about why certain forms, certain choices of medium may well have become more salient in the last 25 years or so. So this now brings me to a somewhat more critical, this has so far been descriptive, I've mapped out these four genealogies. I now briefly want to attend to the problems of having these four genealogies. Now, it's not an unproblematic being if you have these four different genealogies that work in what you do, because there are contradictions among them. Yeah? So what many contemporary artists have is, in fact, a mixed menu of impulses to work from. From the moment of the Romantic, from the avant-garde, there is a certain self-perception as being alienated, if you will. It is a productive alienation because it gives you a different kind of standpoint on reality and on the world. But nonetheless, there is a sense that one is alienated, one is apart from, and one has one's own territory conceptually to define. But on the other hand, from the moment of the Gesamtkunstwerk and from what I've called the moment of contemporary art, there is a very different motif. There's a motif of communion. There's a possibility of engagement with the collective. And I put it to you that these two are actually profoundly contradictory. The notion of being alienated, individuated, cut off, and the notion of being connected, seeking connection, and engaging with a world beyond the art world. But it's not always clear to us that these contradictions in fact exist. And I think that's partly because many of our art practices get flattened and enacted within an established institutional framework of studio, gallery, museum, foundation, biennial, art space, residency. And the effect of these institutions is, on the one hand, to offer a measure of psychic security, if you will, to the artist. But it also has, and I say this with caution, with collegiality and advisedly, this system, this institutionality also promotes a certain professional narcissism. It creates the sense that one is well looked after, one is therefore entitled, and one's questions are somehow more important than the questions of the world outside this institutional system. And I find that, unfortunately, to be very, very rampant. And I find, I mean, you can, if you take this as a touchstone and look at what happens in the world of art, you will find, for instance, that it gets dramatized, particularly in the trope or the practice of collaboration. There is much talk of collaboration, the collaborative turn, collaborative projects, but the strain that inhabits this notion of collaboration is the strain of authorship. It's when you come down to defining authorship that you begin to wonder what happens to the utopian ideals of the collaborative. And all of us have been through these vexations and these questions. And that for me is one of those moments when one questions the turn that art has taken. You begin to ask yourself whether psychic security of the kind I've talked about does not eliminate some of the more critical questions that artists might well be addressing. So whilst your turn towards the collaborative comes from the Gesamtkunstwerk or contemporary art, so defined, your notions of authorship still happen to be premised on the phantoms and specters of the romantic or the avant-garde in its previous avatar. I also find notably absent from many of these considerations the fact of labor, the notion that cultural labor is one kind of labor among others. And this might well be the result of my long ago conditioning in a Marxian ethos. But the fact is that if you are willing to see that you're a worker among others, if what you bring to the table is a certain kind of labor, however immaterialized, however conceptual, without that, you don't actually appreciate the work that other kinds of people are bringing to your projects. And for me, this remains a compelling problem. It also remains a problem at the root of this question of authorship. Instead, we have the fetishization of artwork as noun rather than the work of art as a verb. So this is a thought that I would like to also put in play. And this now brings me to the place and role of the residency program, because I've had seemingly harsh things to say about the institutional system that makes art possible. But I'm also wondering whether the ground of, for instance, the residency program might well be also the ground of redemption. Might it be the space where we begin to look more sensitively at some of these questions I've put out? So when I think about the residency as a form, and I have to say I've been the very happy beneficiary of residencies myself, and it's been absolutely wonderful for my own work, so I would be the last person to oppose such a form. When you look at it, you find that residencies are crucial because artistic practice, like any form of cultural practice, requires refinement and recalibration with reference to its own internal logic and also to stimuli that it receives from a rapidly changing environment. So the residency, the refresher, occasions of cross-training, occasions of mutual pedagogy are all to be cherished because it's through these that the artist traces an arc of replenishing experience and also acquires forms of expertise. Now, I want to dwell a little bit on this notion of expertise because it's at once material and immaterial. Expertise is the name we give to an artist's ability to negotiate medium, to work with history, to reflect on ethos, to calibrate relationships and opportunities. I mean, it's a whole spectrum of different kinds of abilities and gifts that comes with a territory. But then going forward from this acquisition of expertise, I think there might be two ways that an artist can go. And I'm thinking of a situation where an artist who's the beneficiary of residency emerges. What happens next? Would such an artist take that expertise and make that simply part of what I've called a professional narcissism? Is it something that will continue to replenish an individual career, its own idiosyncratic moves? And to that extent, will the artist then be an expert among experts in a highly technocratic ethos of the kind we live in? So that's one possibility. Or might the artist use that expertise to open up other kinds of spheres of engagement? with non-artists, with collaborators specifically who happen not to be artists? Would the artist then become a sort of trustee of expertise is the kind of question that I have in mind. How would that artistic expertise be diffused beyond a professional narcissism? It's not like I have answers, but I think the questions are worth looking at. And as I conclude, I would like to also remind ourselves of yet another genealogy of the artist, of the contemporary artist, which I've so far left unexamined. And that is the genealogy that comes from the figure originally called the poet, who was simply the maker, who was simply the craftsperson in ancient Greece, the artisan. And there's a very interesting word that is applied to the artisan in Greek political theory, and that word is demiurgos, the demiurge. To some of us, that's a theologically loaded word. It refers to a certain kind of subordinate creator. But in the original instance, it simply meant a public worker, someone whose work had not only what we now think of as a precious aesthetic value in itself, but it also had value to a larger social formation. And I would like to hold on to this genealogy among the others because it points us towards a more modest, a more dialogic possibility for what art might do in the larger social field. It points us also towards the reclamation of labor as something an artist does, or a category which might be applied to what artists do. And for that reason, I would like to hold on, as I conclude, to this notion of the demiurgos, the public worker, who's also the poetess, the poet. And in brief, what I would like to say is that the more closely we look at the various kinds of ancestries that our practices contain in a subliminal way, the more we might find ourselves in a space of self-criticism. Because just as we turn the optic of criticality out to the world, it's equally important to retain that measure of criticality towards our own practices and to set aside what I've characterized as the sense of entitlement that comes with being an artist and to look more closely at these other kinds of responsibilities that might not narrow but actually expand what it is we do. Yeah? Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ranjit, for that absolutely wonderful talk. You've given us so much to think about. My head's actually spinning at the moment. Could I, we'll now move on to Pallavi. Pallavi, whose performance you will witness next, is a PhD student at JNU. She works mainly with video and installation and describes her practice as, I quote, engaged in the technologies of poetry and time travel. Like Ranjit, her impressive biography is printed in the booklet you have. Read it and you will get an insight into what really inspires her. May I invite Pallavi up? Thank you.
So first, Ranjit, I'm completely mind blown by the way in which you've pointed out some very significant and some very difficult questions that all of us must be asking ourselves, and I'm actually thankful for that. So thank you for starting. And a big thank you to all of you for being here. Very special thanks to the INLAX Foundation and Amita ma'am for always being a constant and abundant source of encouragement. Many thanks also to Ranjit again for the promise of a conversation later today evening. I hold this as a gift. Thank you. I'm also doubly thrilled because Aaron Caesar of the Delphina Foundation is here. And without his untiring efforts and literally hunting people down over phone calls, emails, and in person, the project that I want to share with you today would have simply not been possible. A big thank you to all at INLAX and Delphina Foundation, and to Aaron and Amita ma'am for working your magic always. Before I open up the specific project which I have brought with me for discussion, I would like to take you through the larger concerns at play in my practice. And I use a simple question as a point of departure for doing this. I ask repeatedly myself and the world, what is a fact? Its varying textures, tonalities, and intensities present themselves to me differently each time. Running parallel to the story of an invisibilized secret agent around whom today's performance has been structured, whose life was made as cryptic as her death by multiple and contesting entries in official files, is a conjecture on the status of the fact itself. In a beautiful passage on exhaustion, novelist Roberto Cavallini writes, and I quote, "Exhaustion is any place whatsoever, even in the middle of nowhere. Over there, it is neither passive nor active. Exhaustion is not even in between the possibility of being together. The passivity of action, exhaustion, can just be something that resides within the tangible appraisal of an essential solitude. No company, no friendship, no love, no fear. There is no sharing of exhaustion." Unquote. I reckon that the fact can be thought of as an exhausted story. After all its adventures are over and its promiscuity is silenced, the story inhabits the celibate garb of the fact. And in this avatar, the solitude of the story seems sealed. There can only be one fact. It has no companions, and its relationship to the world is often in opposition to other stories. It is this exhaustion, this seemingly unbreakable solitude of the fact, that I try and struggle against in my practice. And the slideshow is not working, but I will still continue. The story I bring to you today is that of an SOE secret agent, Noor Inayat Khan. A historical counterstatement in some ways, her story has been mostly liminal to history writing and public memory in the UK, but to a larger extent in India, and that's her. Noor was the great 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 granddaughter of Tipu Sultan, the emperor of Mysore, whose iconic struggle against British colonialism has been well recorded. A descendant of Maula Baksh and the daughter of Sufi mystic Hazrat Inayat Khan, Noor was born to an American mother, Nora Ray Baker, in Moscow. At the outbreak, the family soon moved to Paris when Hazrat traveled there to set up a school of Sufi learning. And at the outbreak of the Second World War, disenchanted by Europe, he decided to return to India. But his family and his wife and children stayed on. When Paris did fall to the Nazis, they left and settled in England. Enraged by the spread of fascism and left to find a living for her family and siblings, Noor enlisted in the British Army and was very soon picked up to be a radio operator by the SOE, owing for her flair for languages. She, of course, spoke English and French, and her ambiguous looks. She was now a secret agent and was sent to Paris under the code name Madeleine. In September 1944, roughly 3 months after her arrival, she was betrayed to the Gestapo, arrested, and shot through the back of her head at a concentration camp at Dachau. This is a little biographical capsule, the details of which I know through some written historical records and some documentary films that have been made on her life. However, when I did reach London, which was when I was in residence at the Delphina Foundation, in search of images that would help me navigate this story, like a good have-been student of the documentary film, I found myself making my way to the archives to verify one last time the truth of these facts. I must underline here that before this point, I was more or less interested in reshooting some of the locations, public sculptures, houses, and institutions that had featured in films on her before. So in my most initial thoughts about this would-be film, I was thinking in the mode of an abstract form of investigation, or intentionally finding something out by accident. But this foolproof plan of mine, which was all geared towards serendipity, came to a grinding halt when I did finally start reading her official file. I realized very quickly that to try and create an image in the way that I had imagined would not only be difficult, but also counterintuitive to the experience of this historical absence. A crime had occurred, but there was no dead body, no murder weapon, no crime scene, no time of death, and no identifiable criminals. In other words, the only document then that was available to me was the story itself. To give you a better sense of this, I read to you 2 contesting entries from her files. Next slide, please. Entry 1. She was taken with 3 others to the Dachau camp on September 12th of 1944. On arrival, she was taken to the crematorium, made to kneel against a mound of earth, and shot through the back of her head. This is one entry. Another entry says, and this is a letter written to the brother of Noor by the SOE, "Dear Mr. Khan, according to our investigations, we can confirm beyond doubt that ASO Noor Inayat was amongst the girls who was taken captive at the Natzweiler camp, given a lethal injection, and immediately cremated. This is only one example of the ways in which this only surviving official document of her life implodes upon itself. In fact, given the schizophrenic nature of these visceral and sensorially palpable retellings and revisions, one thing became quite obvious to me, that what I had in front of me was not even a story, but actually a claim to a story. And I use the term claim for its restlessness. A claim has to always be made. It is always in construction, always levitating in the zone between true and false. A claim may exist independent of evidence, but in the absence of this ambiguous assertion, the truth may never exist. In other words, the truth has to always be claimed. When I began to see it like this, the material came alive with a violent kind of force. The thicker the information and the facts, the more obscure became her body. And so I understood that I needed to create a philosophical extrapolation, if you may, not in spite of this tussle, but because of it. Next slide, please. Having laid out the basic shape of the material, I would now like to fast track to the use of the Morse code, which is very central to this performance, in use for over 100 years now, and extensively used during the Second World War. Morse code is a system of converting alphabets into procedural signs. The signals comprise of dots and dashes, are pronounced as dit and da, respectively. An offshoot of the telegraph system, the Morse code can be thought of as a lossless data compression system. The underlying principle is that unnecessary information is erased in order to transfer information more economically. At the heart of any coding mechanism lies the idea of entropy. Entropy in information theory is the amount of information contained as well as dissipated, which helps one approximate the uncertainty of any information source. So what we see is a tension between efficiency and truth. The mechanism of this language, to me, read like an allegory to the files of the secret agents, which I found in the National Archives in London. What also made the use of the Morse interesting for me was that not only was Noor using it a lot during the war, but also that as a language, it was meant to be enunciated only by machines. In making the body the premise for this sonic enunciation, in which the word masquerades as a note, and I mean note both in its musical sense as well as a noting in a file or a record. And in linking the mechanical to the sensual, what I'm trying to do is to pull at the entrails of this marginalia, where more has to be erased for more to be seen. Next image, please. Now, so these are the images from the performance that I did when I was in London at the Imperial War Museum. And as I told you, that the inability to make images based on what was already available to me needed me to arrive at a visual strategy, which eventually congealed around this performance, which we will all undertake together today. But in the earlier versions of the performance, I have read with occasional floating participants, and the scroll that you see in these images, which I will also unfurl amongst all of you today, is actually her file. It is her file, which I have transcribed into Morse code, and the performance needs all of us to read all of those entries together in Morse. And I hope that doing this will help me reinscribe her back into history with some kind of a critical force, and also push at the possibility of gibberish as a form of intelligibility. And again, you're free to read a word, a sentence, an entire entry, or 2 entries, and we'll see how it goes. So let's get it dying. Request people sitting in these 2 aisles to turn their chairs at a 90-degree angle so that you face is to be enunciated at the dit, and the dash is da. We can all actually already start. The dots are dit and the dashes are da.
Third story of the neighboring house. They're smashed a window and into the apartment. As the guards and officials have been interviewed, they were successful at making
Cover your personality as an agent. Use the name Vladimir. Receive and send messages. Cinema circuit. Although you are under his command and will take
She had broken through the iron bars in her cell leading to the window
just
of the seat.
regards the
She
technicalities
climbed up the first
of
floor
security.
by the means of strips of blankets and sheets knotted together.
Given
She
your
lowered
poem,
herself on
you
the
have
balcony.
chosen the phrases and done the numbering. All you need to do is start at the top of your list with keys and use the keys already worked out. Remember to make telegrams 100% safe. As the contact address is that is library,
One of her
with a clear to me that
She was
the
captured
question
by the
was
journalists
readily
and incarcerated in various concentration camps.
therefore appears late without open or accidental receipt. It was noted that the password for the emergency contact is, do you have new copy? The reply is no.
The circumstances under which she was eventually killed have been the subject of lengthy and laborious detailed investigation and science.
Thank you for being such coach and participating.
Thank you, Pallavi. We'll just roll the scroll while you and Ranjit start your conversation. It will just roll on its own. And
There's something incredibly visceral about that whole performance. You know, I'm just going to start with throwing out sort of the clues.
Right.
It just reminded me so much of this historical artifact, the original typescript of Jack Kerouac's On the Road,
Right.
where
Yeah.
apparently he just wrote it in a mad fury, and it was just one sheet after another which he just stuck together, leading Truman Capote to cruelly say, "That's not writing, it's typing." but the fact is that it was, you know, I've always been amazed at this possibility where the written word just unrolls, it literally unfolds like this. So that was absolutely wonderful. And the way we read it, or those of our friends here who did read it, it, you know, it kind of reminded you also of a tabla bowl or a certain sort of, you know, not that one makes any sense at all of the code as
Right.
read,
Right. Absolutely.
but it leads you to
yeah.
another kind of way of thinking about.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting
Communication.
that you say that because yesterday Sridhar was here for the run through and he said that it sounded like, you know, the Kathak, like da din din. And he was actually like, he made that connection as well. And yeah, it's, yeah, to me, it's also, you know, the possibility of something so precise, also sounding so much like gibberish, you know. And to me, it was very much, like I said, an allegory to the way I saw the establishment or the official kind of the SOE narrative framing the possibility of Noor's disappearance. Like they almost do it in this kind of officious way, which seems so factual, but it actually is not factual. And, you know, kind of it sounds like gibberish, you know, if you read it back to back. Like literally, also in the file, because there's 4 versions of her death. There's 3 different ways in which she disappears over the course of 2 days, and so it makes no sense when you read it, you know, all at once. And to me, and to me that was all kind of feeding into this when I was kind of finding a way of, like I said, create an image for her disappearance, you know, and so
Because that also sets me thinking about a form that many of us have been fascinated by now for a long time, the archive. And somehow in our minds and in many of our practices, the archive has come to be enshrined as a kind of primal source. But when you actually get down to the doing of it, it turns out to be a compilation of different kinds of
conjecture.
conjectures. Yeah, exactly. So tell us a little bit about this, your fascination with the archive and how you actually produce narrative out of it. It's not like the archive is a narrative. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, and again, like a
You might need
to
to
be
be in the mic. I'm not sure it's audible.
can you? Yeah, I think it's okay. So to me, again, that's a very provocative question because I think a lot about ways of thinking about the future, and I think that in some ways I feel that artists are the best people to work in that sense with archival material or historical material because a lot of it, I mean, the relationship between history and future we now know is not a linear relationship, and that's kind of an idea which is very much a part of our ecology now. But then what is that relationship, right? And to me, the relationship between history and future is very much a relationship about the persistent trace of the future in the path of history and history in the path of the future, and whatever that may be, you know. And to me, the archive represents that tension, you know, that it represents this, to me, it's the question of the trace. It's not the question of the story, but there's the trace of the story, that you keep encountering at the archive. And every single time, the trace presents itself differently to you. And it is so, and the trace itself is this, makes you think about questions of dismemberment, questions of, all of those things. So to me, the question of working with the archive is very much a question of working with the future, and the various possibilities of speculating the future and kind of honing that, like you said, the question of expertise, that how well can you, in some ways, learn to, play with the future. To me, the archive holds clues to that more than kind of a historical sort of, the kind of aura of the archive which one is familiar with. So for me, the archive, I am fascinated with it, less for its aura of historical verifiability, but more as a site of play and speculation.
But what would specifically, this is slightly, I'm playing devil's advocate, what would specifically distinguish an artist's use of the archive from, say, a historian's? I'm thinking particularly of Shahid Amin's book. I mean, it's been in the works for about 15 years. His study of the cult of Ghazi Mia, which has just come out. And effectively, he brings to his project many of the interests, the emphases that an artist might.
Because Shahid is an exceptional historian.
That is true.
He's not like a regular historian anyway. To me, Shahid is an artist. In his use of material. Of course, there is the disciplinary imperative, and of course, history writing, as we know, like from not only Amin's work, but so many contemporary historians, like even somebody like Aransir or people like Agamben have pointed us to the limits of history writing in itself. But I feel there's this beautiful play, in Amin's deploying of different kinds of material and kind of weaving. And to me, actually, I aspire to do that kind of work. Maybe I'm doing it in other ways, or I'm like you said, you use this beautiful word, strategies. I love that word. That maybe I'm deploying different strategies to do it. But yes, I do think that the rigor, of practices which use it is a very rigorous thing to do. It is not a question of, in that sense, kind of trivializing the rigor of going through all of this material and kind of trying to make sense of it and assemble it and then reassemble it in one's own way. But then finally what emerges out of it is a narrative which is kind of, keeping alive the possibility of doubt and keeping alive the possibility of conjecture. It's not converting that space of conjecture into something else, into some kind of, heavy sort of object. So to me, I actually love Shahid's work, and I think it's a great way to talk about the archive.
Because for whatever reason, it seems like a coincidence, but 3 of the books that I've really been fascinated by in the last 6 months or so have all been historians who are dealing with some of these questions. I mean, there's Dipesh Chakravarti looking at Jadunath Sarkar, an intellectual biography. Nayanjot Lahiri's biography of Ashoka, again, created out of very fragmentary materials, the edicts, and there's, of course, Shahid's book. But in each case, I find that for a professional historian, these explorations or these discoveries or these accounts become part of a larger disciplinary account of histories, moments, figures. What happens to an artist's research? What happens, for instance, now that you're looking at Noor Inayat Khan? What might be the larger context of your findings, if you will, or your research? Where would that be situated? Would that be situated within your own practice, within a set of artistic practices that are premised on the archive? Might it be a contribution to the history of the Second World War? Where do you see your contribution? It's a huge question, but have you had thoughts about that?
I don't know in what different contexts the story will find resonance with different kinds of things, but I definitely am sure about one thing, that I want to keep alive the agility or the possibility of it participating in different contexts. That's something that I'm very sure about. So yes, I would very much like to maybe, a piece of writing, to do a piece of writing around this. I am currently working on making a film, which is completely based on material salvaged from the internet around the Second World War and creating this kind of fantasy thing. Then there was, of course, this performance. I would try and explore other things, like, this other actually very interesting thing which I found when I was working at the National Archives were the Playfair code cards, which the soldiers were using. And it was almost like finding an archive within an archive, because they were writing phrases which they thought they are never going to forget. So they were actually like haikus, so there was like, smoke gets into your eyes, or I miss you, or 20th century last train, like there were these like kind of really haunting, fascinating Playfair code cards. So for instance, I made portraits of those cards when I was at the archive, as you would photograph someone's face. So again, like, I think the material in itself is so troubling that you need to keep sort of enacting it in some ways, and renegotiating with it, and reconvening with it in different ways, again and again and again. And I hope to keep doing that. Yeah. So
So, could you tell us a little bit about the sort of community of practice or community of practitioners that you've sort of formed around you through this? Because you have a hybrid practice, and it involves engagement with and discussion with different kinds of people who might be interlocutors or collaborators or navigators. So, do you want to talk a little bit about the sort of everyday life of research, collaboration, conversation, and the ways in which it takes you outside of what you might call the art world proper?
yeah, totally. And I think that's very important for me, actually. As Amita ma'am mentioned, that I'm currently doing my PhD at JNU, and in some ways, I really cherish the fact that I have this other world that I can step out of this world and go into that other world and kind of encounter people, completely different economy of things, completely different ethic of doing things, rigor, different forms of rigor, different interests, and different aspirations. Most importantly, people aspire to very different things in different worlds, and to me, that's a thing that I hold very dear. I will always want to be an outsider in every sphere. And I really like that, because it gives me the ability to move in and out, while also learning from each part of each world that I participate in. And yeah, and I'm very thankful to the contemporary art context for giving nourishment to the kind of work that I do. But I also hold very dear this other life that I have outside of the contemporary art. And yeah, my friends are poets, filmmakers, researchers, botanists, scientists. So yeah, all kinds of people, and I think it keeps you sane and keeps you happy, most importantly.
Well, I've shared so many disquietudes, I might share yet another one, which is that with certain kinds of practices, such as yours, and the kinds of practices that I characterized as post 1989 in a certain way, uh, sometimes you begin to wonder whether everything that gets produced by such a practitioner needs to be presented under the rubric of art. I mean, does it? That's the question. Yeah. I mean, there might be things you do with a different objective in mind, or no objective at all. I mean, why is it necessary? For instance, many of us have talked about artistic research or art as knowledge production to the point where these terms seem to have lost their meaning, actually. So I'm trying hard not to use them in things I write. But why does everything an artist need to do? It's a banal way of putting it, but does everything that an artist does that need to be consecrated as art? Or might it be sedimented somewhere else or never even exposed? Do you want to respond to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, again, like, I would again borrow from something that you said in your talk, which is that you asked this question, that what is art autonomous of, right? And an extension of that could be that exposed to whom, because uh, like we use the word practice, and I think if you pay a little more attention to the idea of what practice is, it's a question of being, right? And it's not so much a question of producing or doing. And when you be, you don't always be for an audience or something. And this in no way means to disengage with the world. This in no way means to again have no sense of accountability. It means many other things other than just aspiring to be canonized or recognized by some people. Because actually, the art community is so small and the world is so big. There's so much more to, and sometimes actually I ask a very silly question to myself also, that there's so much to see in the world, no? Like when we go outside, we see so many things, and then why do we have to see some things as art? Like, and these are questions I think which are very important to keep alive, to just continue like doing things which have some sort of force in the world that we live in some ways, yeah.
And given that time travel is an important trope for you, it also has certain political implications. Because if you have a wager on a certain kind of future or alternative futures, where does it take its place in a political environment now where we seem to be dominated by people who have a rather precise idea of the future? So, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Of course. I mean, so after the election, after the Modi election, there were many kinds of questions, that my friends from outside of this country were asking me. They were like, "Oh, what's happening?" And the first thing I told them was that the people of India seem to have discovered their sense of humor, you know. And that was great because you saw, like all of these crazy memes and jokes and, like people photoshopping things onto his picture, and it had never happened to any other leader in that sense, before. But the one thing that I do see when I see what's happening around politically, of course, it's depressing and it's very sad, or to see what's happening to our institutions, what's happening in FTI today, BHU, any university you name, and this is all happening. But the one thing that I do see is a very fearful state for the first time. They are so scared. We have a prime minister who doesn't want students to be around when he's going for a convocation. We have a chairman of a premier institution who doesn't want students around him when he's going to address his first meeting. These people are scared of us. And that's actually in some ways very enabling. And it's very actually encouraging. So I think as artists, we need to keep track of the fact that they are scared and to keep capitalizing on that fear that they have. And of course, not falling into a simple narrative of victimhood, because censorship is also one of the best things that can happen to an artist in some ways, So yeah, to just keep alive play and to keep alive a sense of defiance, I think, is very important. And yes, politics is a very, very significant thing as far as my practice is concerned. And yes, I believe that there should be an equal world and no disparity, and class is a very important concern. And yeah, and Marxism is not that far away from me, from where I stand.
Just one last thing, I think. Building on what you've just said, if a certain kind of institutional ground or public funding or public institutions now seem to be closed off in a way to more progressive and redemptive work, what do you see a future in collaborations or cooperative forms? Is it something you already do, alternative platforms? Is that an ecology that you already work in?
Yes, in terms of, and just one small thing is that, in any way, institutions are not supposed to anyway, like they are of course support structures, but one cannot ever at any moment place the complete onus of a progressive way of thinking on the institution, because all the disruptive thinking has always historically happened around the institution, and the institution has had to fall in line, from the 68 movement onwards, right? So in any case, institutions are institutions, right? But as far as my personal practice is concerned, my most dear collaborator and friend, Vidrohi ji, was a poet at JNU, recently passed away. But yeah, I made 3 films with him, kind of just in conversation with him and kind of his poetry. And yes, I do in some ways see the visual practice. I look at Noor as a collaborator. All kinds of visual kind of material that I do produce, I feel the way I produce it can only happen if you think of the person that you're working with as a collaborator and a co-author. So yeah, I do hold the idea of collaboration very dear, and also have problems with it, and one struggles with that, and kind of comes out sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't work, but it's okay. You keep trying. So yeah.
How are we doing for time? Yeah, great. Fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Well, I think it's conversations like those that mark out INLAC's and INLAC's evenings from the regular love-ins that we often get in the art world. So we're very thankful to Pallavi and Ranjit for the provocations, both in your first keynote lecture, Pallavi's fantastic performance, and then the conversation afterwards. So thank you so much for that. I think it'll be remembered by all of us for a long time. So of course we're gathered here today for the 4 young artists that are sitting up at the front, and it's the opportunity that we have now just to present each of them to you, and little snapshots of their work. So thanks to Amita Malkani and her INLAC's team in Mumbai for their tireless efforts in the promotion of the visual arts in India. The scale at which INLAC's now operates, and which Amita gave you a small snapshot earlier, is truly phenomenal. And I think in terms of the scholarships, art residencies, the Fine Arts Awards, of course, it really puts it in a league of its own in India. And consider, of course, that this is just a small subset of the totality of areas and disciplines which INLAC's is involved in. It's quite mind-boggling. So, on to the winners for 2016. You had mentioned the names of the judges before. Let me just recap. So it was myself, Shilpa Gupta, Jaydeep Mehrotra, and Abhay Sardesai. We're a gang now. We love getting together. A gang in the best sense of the word. Ranjit. And for those of you who don't know, as you said, Amit, there are over 140 people, students, young artists applied, and that's roughly many more. But it can go from the mid 150s up to 200 a year. It's a big number. We then whittle down individually to create long lists, and then we get together and get a short list. And then from that, we then get the opportunity to meet each of the artists one by one, and actually get some hands-on time with the work itself, which is a fantastic experience in itself. And from that meeting, we then arrive at the final 4. So it's a long process, and there is a rigor to it, and I think that the process has proved itself to generate some really interesting artists out of the process, who have gone on, as Amita, I think, has successfully shown, to great things. So to this year's group, so first we have Abir Mukherjee, who, as you can see, did both BFA and MFA from Shantiniketan. In terms of awards, residencies, etc., he's received Government of India National Scholarship, SD Ahuja Art Scholarship, and British Council and V&A Museum Residency. Primarily a painter, the body of work that we were asked to consider was involved with these minute observations, born of hours, days, months of patient looking, producing the suite of paintings which we felt were utterly compelling. The repeated, almost obsessive return to his muses, his immediate surroundings, his living room, parents, brother, and pets produces a rhythm to the series. From these intensely personal settings, the artist reaches back to Renaissance painting for the compositional structure of the works. For instance, in one painting, the artist's mother cradling their pet dog sits in for Mother Mary and baby Jesus. The viewer is carried along by the wit of the artist and his considerable technical ability. And some of these are at scale. I think we're all excited to see where Abir's practice now will take him, and how his exceptional ability to draw out a great deal of emotional energy can come from the most banal of settings. Should we have that light off? I'm right in saying this is the artist's brother? Mother? So thank you, Abir. I'd now like to introduce the work of Mithun Das. Again, MFA Shantiniketan. So an extraordinary fact this year is that we actually usually, as most of you who come to these events will know, that MSU Baroda usually takes up the vast majority of, but it's actually very few. Sorry, say Amito. No, MFA is Shantiniketan. Yeah. He lives in Baroda now. Yeah. Yeah, you can never escape Baroda entirely, but you can. Awarded the All India Fine Arts and Crafts Society, New Delhi, awards from the Biller Academy, Kolkata, Coach Piers, New Delhi in 2015. So as you can imagine, judging work, especially in the context of INLACs, is usually a matter of poring over hundreds of images. So when we do finally get to see the work